She was 17 years old, 4 months pregnant with twins, and standing in the November cold with a single duffel bag and $43 in cash when her father told her she was no longer his daughter. She expected anger when she came back 18 years later. She expected slammed doors and turned backs, and the particular silence of people who have chosen pride over love so many times that the choice has calcified into something they can no longer feel. What she didn't expect was that her mother would open the door, look directly into her face, and not know her, not pretend not to know her, not refuse to acknowledge her, simply, genuinely, not recognize the woman standing on the porch of the house where she had learned to walk, where she had lost her first tooth, where she had once believed she was safe. Her name was Delilah Crane. She was born on a Tuesday in March in a small hospital 20 miles outside of Grover's Hollow, Tennessee, the second child and only daughter of Raymond and Constance Crane, who were, by every outward measure the town could see, a respectable family. Raymond worked in insurance. Constance volunteered at the Methodist Church and made the best lemon pound cake at every bake sale and smiled in the particular way that women in small towns sometimes learn to smile, with warmth enough to satisfy and distance enough to reveal nothing. They lived in a white 2-story house on Caldwell Street with a wraparound porch and a rose garden that Constance tended every spring and summer with a dedication that the neighbors quietly admired and that Delilah, as a little girl, had thought was the most beautiful thing in the world. She was a quiet child, not shy exactly. She had opinions and she would share them if pushed, but fundamentally interior, given to watching and listening before speaking, to sitting on the porch steps in the long summer evenings and looking at things. She looked at the rose garden and thought about how her mother moved through it with scissors and gloves, deliberate and careful, cutting what needed to be cut, coaxing what needed encouragement. She looked at the neighbors' houses and wondered what happened inside them when the lights went on at night. She looked at her father when he came home from work and tried to understand the mechanism of his mood, which shifted like Tennessee weather, sometimes clear and open, sometimes closed in with something dense and unreachable that had no name she could find in any book. She had a gift for reading rooms. She had needed it. Her brother Marcus was 4 years older, and where Delilah was quiet, Marcus was bright and loud and easy in the way that some people are just easy, moving through the world as though it has already agreed to be kind to them. Their parents adored Marcus. This was not a secret and not precisely a wound. Delilah understood it the way you understand a weather pattern, as something that simply was, as part of the climate of the family, rather than a commentary on her worth. Raymond coached Marcus's Little League team. Constance sewed his Halloween costumes with the focus of a woman who believed that the quality of a seam said something about the quality of a character. Delilah made her own costumes from things she found in the attic, and she was proud of them, and nobody noticed, and she was proud of them anyway. She was good in school. Not brilliant in the way that gets announced at dinner tables, but solid and disciplined and genuinely curious about certain things. Literature, mostly, and later biology, the way living things organize themselves, the way systems work or fail. She read constantly. She had a library card that she renewed every year with the seriousness of a business obligation. The library was 3 blocks from school, and she went there on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and sometimes on Saturday mornings when the house felt too full of its own silence, and she would sit at the long table by the window that faced the parking lot and read for 2 or 3 hours and feel, temporarily, like herself. She met Caleb Foster at the beginning of her junior year. He was 18, tall in the way that 17-year-old girls sometimes mistake for steadiness, with dark eyes and a laugh that filled rooms. He had moved to Grover's Hollow from Nashville the previous spring, which gave him an aura of somewhere else, of a larger world. And Delilah was 17 and had never been more than 60 miles from Caldwell Street, so she found this irresistible. He found her in the library on a Tuesday in September and sat across from her and said he'd been watching her read for 20 minutes and wanted to know if the book was worth it. She told him it was. He asked if she'd like to get coffee sometime. She said she would. What followed was 9 months of the particular intensity that is available only to people who have not yet lived long enough to know how temporary everything is. She loved him, not the surface version of love that gets recycled through pop songs, but the specific, terrifying version where another person begins to feel like the place where you are most yourself, where the interior life you have kept so private suddenly has a witness. She told him things she had never said aloud, about the silence in her house, about the way her father looked through her sometimes, about wanting to leave Tennessee and study nursing and see something larger than what Caldwell Street could offer. He listened. He said he understood. He said when the time was right, they would go together. She discovered she was pregnant the first week of June, the summer before senior year. She was 17 weeks along before the reality of it settled into something she could hold still long enough to examine. She had been telling herself stories, that the fatigue was the end of school year, that the nausea was anxiety, that she had time still to figure out what the numbers on the test meant in practical terms, in terms of her actual life on Caldwell Street in the white two-story house with the rose garden. When she finally sat with it, really sat with it, she realized with a clarity that surprised her that she was not afraid of the babies. She was afraid of the house. She told Caleb on a Wednesday evening in his car outside the library. He was quiet for a long time after she told him. Not the quiet of someone processing, the quiet of someone calculating. She watched his face, and she was very good at reading rooms, and she understood before he spoke what he was going to say, and the understanding moved through her like cold water, slow and total. He said he wasn't ready for this. He said he thought she should understand that he had plans that didn't include. He said he was sorry. She got out of his car and walked home, and the distance was 22 minutes, and she counted each minute. She did not cry. She felt something much quieter than crying. A kind of leveling, like furniture being moved out of a room. She went inside and up to her room and sat on her bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about what she was going to do. She told her mother first. On a Thursday morning at the kitchen table, while Raymond was at work and the house was quiet, she sat across from Constance and told her as plainly as she could. Twins, the doctor had said, both healthy. She was 17 weeks along. She wanted to finish school. She needed help. Constance sat very still while Delilah talked. She was wearing her housecoat, the blue one with small white flowers, and she was holding her coffee cup in both hands, and she did not put it down or look away, but something closed behind her eyes, slowly and completely, like a shade being drawn. When Delilah finished speaking, there were several seconds of silence. Then Constance said she needed to call Raymond. She said Delilah should go to her room. Delilah went to her room and sat on her bed and listened to the sound of her mother on the phone, one floor below. She couldn't make out words. She could make out tone. The tone was careful and contained and deeply familiar. Raymond came home at noon. He came directly upstairs. He stood in the doorway of her room and looked at her with an expression she had no name for, something beyond anger, something hardened and conclusive. And he told her in a voice that was almost calm that she had disgraced this family, that she had made a choice, and now she would live with it, but she would not live with it here. He told her she had until Friday to get her things and make other arrangements. He told her he expected her to be gone by the time he came home from work Friday evening. She said, "Daddy." He said, "You made your choice." He closed the door. She sat with that closed door for a long time. She thought about the roses in the garden. She thought about the library card in her wallet. She thought about two small lives moving inside her that had no idea what kind of world they were entering. She did not cry. She packed a duffel bag. She took $43 from the emergency fund she had been keeping in a sock in her bottom drawer since she was 14, saving from birthday money and odd jobs, money she had put aside for college, without quite knowing why she felt it needed to be hidden. She took her library card, her social security card, the photograph of her and Marcus from when she was 8 and he was 12, and they were both squinting into the sun at the county fair. She did not take much else. There wasn't much else that was hers in any meaningful sense. Friday afternoon, she walked out of the house on Caldwell Street into the November cold. It had turned cold suddenly and sharply the way Tennessee Novembers sometimes do, and she stood on the porch for a moment and looked at the rose garden, which was brown and stripped back for winter, and she thought it looked like the botanical equivalent of what had just happened inside the house. And then she walked down the porch steps and turned left on Caldwell Street and did not look back. She was 17 years old. She had $43 and a duffel bag and twins growing inside her who would arrive, the doctor had told her, sometime in mid-January, which was 8 weeks away. She walked to the library. She had not thought it through beyond that. The library felt like the only place that had consistently been itself, reliable and warm and without agenda. She sat at the long table by the window and looked at the parking lot for a while. It was getting dark. The library closed at 8. She had not thought beyond 8 o'clock. This was an unusual failure for someone who was constitutionally good at thinking ahead, and she recognized it as a symptom of something she couldn't fully name. Not shock exactly, but the cognitive equivalent of a circuit overloaded. She was thinking through gauze. The librarian's name was June Albright. She was 62 years old, with short silver hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain and hands that had the particular roughness of someone who had spent decades handling paper. She had been Grover's Hollow's head librarian for 19 years. She noticed Delilah the way she noticed things, quietly, thoroughly, without making a production of it. She had watched Delilah come in twice a week for 4 years. She had recommended books that Delilah then read and returned and discussed. She had never asked much about her life beyond the books, but she was observant, and what she was observing now, at 7:45 on a Friday evening, was a 17-year-old girl sitting alone at a table with a duffel bag and visibly pregnant and going nowhere. June Albright locked the front door at 8 and walked to the table and sat down across from Delilah and said, without preamble, "Tell me what's happening." And Delilah, who had not cried once in the 2 days since her father had stood in her doorway and told her she had disgraced this family, told June Albright everything. And when she was done, she put her face down on her hands on the long library table and cried the way the creek ran after a heavy rain. Fully, loudly, her voice filling the space between the shelves. June Albright waited until she was finished. Then she said, "Let's get you somewhere safe tonight and figure out the rest in the morning." The somewhere safe was June's house, a small bungalow 8 blocks from the library, with a guest room that smelled like cedar and lavender and had a quilt on the bed that June had made herself. Delilah ate soup from a tin cup, vegetable thick and hot, and then she slept for 11 hours straight, which she had not done in weeks. In the morning, June made eggs and coffee, and they sat at a small kitchen table with morning light coming through yellow curtains, and June said, "All right, let's talk about what this looks like." What it looked like, with June's help, was this. Delilah applied for emergency housing assistance and was placed 3 weeks later in a transitional housing unit in Maryville, 31 miles from Grover's Hollow, a small apartment with a single bedroom and a bathroom with a slow drain and a kitchen with a 2-burner stove. June drove her there herself, helped her carry in the duffel bag and a box of things June had put together: blankets, canned food, a small lamp, a copy of a pregnancy guide with a note in June's handwriting tucked in the front. "You are not alone. You never have been. Call me when they arrive." The twins arrived on a Saturday in the second week of January, 6 days before their due date. A girl and a boy. She was in labor for 14 hours. There was no one in the waiting room. The nurse who helped her through the last 2 hours of it had a braid down her back and a soft voice and said, "You're doing so well, honey. You're doing so beautifully." And Delilah held on to those words like a physical thing, turned them over in her mind in the hardest moments, used them as something to push against. "You're doing so well." She named the girl Iris after the flower because she had always loved the way irises came back every year without being asked. She named the boy Eli, which meant something about being raised up. She was not religious, but she liked the idea of it. She held them in the small hospital room and looked at their faces, scrunched and red and completely alive, so completely and urgently alive. And something settled in her chest that was not peace exactly, but was a kind of clarification. She understood what she was doing now. She understood why. The next 5 years were the hardest years of her life, and she never apologized for that characterization, not to herself, not to anyone. She worked. She worked with a completeness that left room for almost nothing else. She worked mornings at a laundromat on Morrison Street, sorting and folding from 6 to 11. Then she walked 8 blocks to a diner where she waitressed the lunch shift until 3. Then she picked up the twins from the subsidized daycare on Elm, where Miss Patricia, who was 60 and patient, watched them for $18 a day, and she brought them home and fed them whatever she had managed to put together from the grocery store and put them to bed and studied. She was working toward her GED first, and then, over the following 4 years, toward the CNA certification that would let her work in healthcare, and then, because she did not stop, because stopping was not available to her as an option, toward the LPN coursework offered 3 evenings a week at the community college 20 miles away, which she attended after the twins were in bed, driving the used Civic she'd bought for $1,200 from a man in her building who was moving to Alabama. She did not have friends in any robust sense during those years. She had people she knew, Miss Patricia, who would sometimes send her home with extra food, the woman in the next apartment, Linda, who was 50 and worked nights at a processing plant and would occasionally knock on the wall twice when she heard the twins screaming to let Delilah know she was there, the instructor at the community college, a man named Dr. Osi, who told her in her second semester that she had a genuinely exceptional clinical mind and asked if she had ever considered becoming a registered nurse. She had considered it. She considered it constantly, in the same way she considered oxygen, as something fundamental and not yet available. The twins grew. This was the astonishing and sustaining fact of those years. The twins grew, constantly and unstoppably, in the way that children do when someone is pouring everything into them. Iris was intense and early with words, talking in full sentences by 18 months, asking questions at 2 that Delilah had to look up answers to, reading at 4 with a focus that reminded Delilah of herself at the library table. Eli was slower with language, but physical and fearless, climbing everything, collecting things, rocks, feathers, bottle caps, a sequence of sticks he selected with great deliberation from the ground outside their building, each one kept for a specific reason he would explain in great detail to anyone who asked. They were different from each other in almost every way. They were both magnificent. She told them very little about her family. Not nothing. She was honest in the way that she could be at each age. But the full architecture of it she kept from them because she did not see what good it would do a 6-year-old to know that their grandfather had put their mother out of his house in November. She said her parents lived far away. She said she didn't see them much. She said families were complicated. She said the most important thing she had learned about family was that it could be chosen. And she pointed to Miss Patricia and Linda and June, who still called on the twins' birthdays without fail, who still sent books in the mail. These are our family, she said, the people who show up. She became a registered nurse at 29. It took 6 years of coursework around the edges of everything else. Mornings at the hospital for clinicals before the laundromat shift, she eventually traded for a night shift CNA position that paid better. Evenings at the college, weekends with the twins doing homework at the kitchen table, all 4 of them, her, Iris, Eli, and whatever textbook she was currently working through. She was 31 when she got her first RN position in the neonatal intensive care unit of a hospital in Knoxville, 45 miles from Maryville. She was 34 when she was made charge nurse. She was 35 when the twins started high school, and Iris announced she was going to become a doctor, and Eli announced he was going to become an engineer, and Delilah sat in the kitchen after they had gone to bed that night and held her face in her hands and felt something she had been rationing for years finally move through her freely. They moved to Knoxville when the twins were 9, a 2-bedroom apartment, then 3 years later, a small house with a yard. Not grand, nothing on Caldwell Street scale, but theirs. A real door with a real key. A small patch of earth out back that Delilah planted with irises in the spring, which came back every year without being asked. It was Iris who asked the question. She was 17 years old, the same age Delilah had been, and this symmetry was not lost on Delilah, sitting at the kitchen table doing homework on a Tuesday evening in October. The question came without preamble, dropped into a silence the way a stone gets dropped into still water. "How come I've never met your parents?" Iris said. She didn't look up from her book. "How come they never visit? How come we never talk about them?" Delilah was at the counter. She was cutting carrots. She put down the knife. She looked at her hands on the counter for a moment. Her daughter was 17 and perceptive, and she had always known, at some level, that this question was coming, had felt it approaching for years the way you feel a weather change in the pressure of the air. And still, when it arrived, the directness of it moved through her like something loosening. She said, "Come sit with me." They sat at the table. Eli was at a friend's house. The kitchen was quiet with the particular quiet of a weekday evening, the muffled sounds of the neighborhood outside, the hum of the refrigerator. Delilah told her daughter the truth. Not every detail. Some details were hers to keep, but the shape of it. That she had been 17 when she had the twins. That her father had put her out. That she had spent 18 years building something from a duffel bag and $43 and a kind woman named June who had found her in a library. that she had not been back to Grover's Hollow since the November day she walked away from Caldwell Street, that she had not spoken to her parents since the phone call she had made from the hospital after the twins were born, when she had called the house on Caldwell Street and her mother had answered, and Delilah had told her the babies were here and they were healthy, and she had waited, holding the phone and the newborn Iris simultaneously, and Constance had said, "That's good to hear," and then there had been silence, and then Constance had said, "Your father is at work," and then the call had ended. Iris was quiet through all of it. When Delilah finished, she looked at her mother for a long moment, with the dark, direct eyes she had always had, eyes that took things in completely before responding. Then she said, "I think you should go back. I think you need to go see what happened to them." Delilah said, "Iris." Iris said, "Not for them, for you." She paused. "You always told us that leaving something unfinished takes more energy than finishing it. This is unfinished." Delilah looked at her daughter, at 17 years old, at her own young face, rebuilt in a new form, at someone who had been made out of the hardest years and had turned out like this, clear and wise and willing to say the hard thing with kindness, and felt the word magnificent move through her again, the way it always had. Then she said, "How did you get so sensible?" Iris said, "I had a good teacher." It took her 3 weeks after that conversation to make the decision, and then another 2 weeks to make the practical arrangements, and then she drove to Grover's Hollow on a Thursday in November. 18 years, almost to the month. The same gray November light. The same cold, sharpening the air. And she sat in her car at the end of Caldwell Street for 7 minutes before she could make herself drive to the house. What she saw when she turned onto the block was not what she had kept in her mind for 18 years. The houses were largely the same, the street the same, the familiar right angle of the stop sign at the corner. But the white 2-story house was different in ways she registered one at a time, each one landing separately. The porch railing was loose on one side, listing slightly, unpainted. A shutter on the upper right window was hanging at a wrong angle, half detached. The rose garden, her mother's rose garden, the thing she had tended with scissors and gloves every spring and summer, deliberate and careful, was gone. Not dead, not unkempt. Gone. In its place was a stretch of gravel with a plastic lawn chair sitting in it at an angle, as though someone had put it there in a hurry and never came back to straighten it. She sat in the car and looked at the space where the roses had been. The gravel was gray and featureless, and a plastic bag was caught in the wire border of what had once been the garden bed, lifting and settling in the wind. She got out of the car. She walked up the porch steps, which creaked in a new way. She knocked. The door opened, and her mother was standing there. Constance Crane was 71 years old, and the woman in the doorway wore that age plainly. She was smaller than Delilah remembered, the dense, competent posture, reduced to something more tentative, her hair fully white and thin, her face rearranged by time in the way that faces are, the familiar structure still present underneath, but overlaid with something that had the texture of long-endured difficulty. She was wearing a cardigan that had been washed too many times, and slippers that had once been pink. She looked at Delilah with eyes that were clouded around the edges, not with cataracts exactly, but with the particular film of early cognitive change that Delilah recognized immediately, professionally, with a clinical accuracy that landed in her chest before her mind could catch up. Her mother looked at her and did not know her, looked directly into the face of her only daughter, the child she had nursed and dressed and sent to school for 17 years, and her expression held not recognition, not avoidance, but genuine, complete blankness. Delilah stood very still. Her mother said pleasantly, "Can I help you?" She said it the way you say it to a stranger. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Delilah stood on the porch of her childhood home and looked at her mother's unrecognizing face and felt a series of things that arrived simultaneously and could not be separated. Grief and shock, and something that was not quite anger, and something that was not quite relief, and underneath all of it, a very old wound reopening cleanly, like a seam giving way. Then she said, "Mom, it's Delilah." Her mother blinked. The blankness held for another second, 2, 3. Then something moved behind her eyes, slow and underwater, like a recognition trying to surface through depth. "Delilah," she said, and the name was strange in her mouth, tentative, as though she were trying it, testing whether it fit the face in front of her. Yes, Delilah said. I'm Delilah. I came home. She didn't know then, couldn't have known from the porch, that her mother had been diagnosed 8 months earlier with early-stage vascular dementia, the result of 2 small strokes in the previous 2 years that the family doctor had identified, but that no family member had been present to hear about because the family had reduced, over 18 years, to Raymond and Constance and a sparse, infrequent contact with Marcus, who had moved to Nashville and built a life that did not include regular trips to Caldwell Street. That Raymond's health had declined sharply in the preceding 3 years. His heart, finally, the organ that had been running the coldest in the household for decades, causing him literal clinical problems that his pride had delayed addressing for too long. That he was inside the house right now, in the living room, in the chair by the window, and he was not well. She learned these things gradually, in the 2 hours that followed, sitting in the living room of her childhood home, which was dim and close, and smelled of something old and institutional, like the underside of a hospital room's formality. Constance made tea with great concentration, moving carefully through the kitchen, as though the sequence of steps required deliberate reconstruction. She spilled some of the water and cleaned it up slowly. She couldn't find the sugar. She brought the tea in without saucers, and then stood in the middle of the living room for a moment, as though she had forgotten why she was there. Raymond was in the chair by the window. He looked up when Delilah came into the room, and she watched his face do what her mother's had done, and then, faster, do what her mother's had not. Recognition arrived, complete and immediate, followed by something she had to look at carefully to name. It was not quite guilt. It was older than guilt and more calcified, like a thing that has been buried too long to come up clean. He said her name once. He said, Delilah, just that. She said, Dad. He looked older than 74 in the way that people sometimes do when the architecture of their sense of themselves has been eroding longer than their bodies. He was thin in a way he had not been, and there was a quality to his stillness in the chair that she read immediately. The nurses read, the clinical overlay she couldn't turn off, as someone for whom movement had recently become something to be conserved. She sat in the chair across from him and looked at him. They looked at each other. He did not speak for a long time. Constance had drifted back toward the kitchen, with some intention that she seemed to lose track of halfway there. Finally, he said, How long has it been? She said, 18 years. He looked at the window. The light through it was gray and flat and winter thin. He said, I know. He said it the way someone says something they have been saying to themselves for a long time, quietly, alone in chairs by windows, until the saying of it has worn smooth. He said, I've known for 18 years. She did not fill the silence that followed, because she did not trust what would come out of her if she opened it. She had rehearsed this conversation in her mind 100 times since October, and every version had been different. Sometimes she was measured and clear, sometimes she was 17 years old again and standing in a doorway with a duffel bag. Sometimes she said things she had held so long they had crystallized into something sharp. Sitting here, she felt none of those versions activate. She felt instead an exhaustion that was old and complete, like arriving at the end of a very long walk. She said, I have 2 children, the twins. They're 18 years old. He closed his eyes briefly, opened them, said, Are they well? She said, They're extraordinary. Something moved across his face that was too complicated to name. He turned back toward the window. He said, I was a coward. He said it simply, without drama, without the scaffolding of explanation or excuse, and the simplicity of it was more devastating than anything elaborate would have been. I chose what I was afraid of, over my daughter. I have lived in that, every day. She looked at her hands in her lap. The kettle was making noise in the kitchen. Constance was moving around in there with her careful, reconstructed steps. The plastic bag in the rose garden outside the window was still lifting and settling in the cold. She said, I'm not here to forgive you. I want you to know that. She said it quietly, and she meant it. I'm not there yet, and I don't know if I will be. But I'm here. And I have 18 years of a life that happened, and 2 children who exist, and I needed to come back to this street and stand in this house and know that I did that. That I made that, not for you, for me. Raymond did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, I know. He said, that's enough. That you're here is enough. He said it as though he were not sure he deserved to say it. She stayed for 4 hours that day. She helped Constance remember where the sugar was, and she made both of them a proper dinner from what was in the refrigerator, which was not much. Eggs, some cheese, half a loaf of bread, a bag of apples, and she sat with them at the kitchen table while they ate, and Constance talked about the rose garden, though she referred to it in present tense, as though it were still there, as though the scissors and gloves were still hanging by the back door. Delilah did not correct her. She let her mother talk about the roses, and she listened, and it was the closest thing to tenderness available to her in this house, on this day, and she took it. Before she left, she stood on the porch for a moment. The November air was cold and still. The gravel where the roses had been was silver gray in the fading light. She thought about the photograph in her wallet from the county fair, herself and Marcus squinting into the sun, both of them so small, both of them before they knew anything about what the house behind them would eventually ask of them. She thought about Iris at 17 at the kitchen table saying, "Not for them, for you." She thought about June Albright's note tucked inside the pregnancy guide, "You are not alone. You never have been." She drove back to Knoxville. She called Iris from a rest stop 40 miles out. Iris answered on the second ring and said, "How did it go?" And Delilah sat in the parking lot of the rest stop with her hands on the steering wheel and said, "I don't know yet. I'll have to let it settle." She said, "Your grandmother didn't know me at first." Iris was quiet for a moment and then said, "Oh, Mom," in a voice that sounded like an embrace. Delilah said, "She knew me eventually." And they said, "She'll know me when you bring me." And Delilah said, "Yes, she will, because she went back." This is the thing that matters, the thing worth saying plainly. She went back, not once. She went back 11 times over the following 10 months. Not because it became easier, not because the wounds healed cleanly, not because Raymond's apology, offered in pieces over several visits, in the oblique and difficult language of a man who had never been taught to speak this way, was sufficient to close 18 years of distance. But because she had decided, and this was a decision, not a feeling, not a reconciliation of the heart, but an act of the will, that she was not going to let what he had done take anything more from her. He had taken the house on Caldwell Street in 18 years, and the particular experience of being someone who has parents who show up. She was not going to let him take the possibility of closure. Marcus came back for the second visit. She had called him first, from the rest stop, and the call had been long and uncomfortable and necessary in the way that lancing something is necessary. He had known, he said, not everything, but enough. He had been 21 when it happened, and he had made the coward's calculation, the same one their father had made, she noted, without saying it, that getting involved would cost him something, and he had protected himself. He said, "I was young." She said, "So was I." The pause that followed was 3 seconds long and contained everything that needed to be contained. Then he said, "Can I come next time?" She said yes. Raymond died in April. His heart, which had been the problem for years, stopped on a Tuesday evening while he was sitting in the chair by the window. Constance found him there, and she did not fully understand what had happened, and this was, in the particular mercy available to those with dementia, possibly a kindness. Delilah drove to Caldwell Street that night when Marcus called. She sat with her mother on the couch, while the people who needed to come came and did what they needed to do, and Constance leaned against her shoulder with the easy, unconscious weight of someone who feels safe, and Delilah sat very still and let her, and did not try to name what she felt, because it was too many things simultaneously, and naming it would have reduced it to something smaller than it was. She helped arrange the funeral. She helped Marcus go through the house. She found, in a box in the closet of her father's study, something she had not expected, a folder. Inside the folder were documents, her school reports from every year, her attendance records, a letter of recommendation from a teacher she had not thought about in 20 years, a printout of what appeared to be a search for her name conducted in 2011 that had turned up a nursing certification and an Appalachian address. The printout was worn at the fold. It had been folded and unfolded many times. She held the folder in her father's study for a long time. Then she put it back in the box and set the box with the things she was taking. Not as evidence of his love, not as absolution, not as a revision of what he had done. She was clear-eyed about that, but as a piece of truth, as evidence that the story had been more complicated than a single November on a porch, which did not make the November acceptable, but which was, in its way, part of what was real. Marcus moved back to Tennessee the following year. Not to Grover's Hollow, to Maryville, close enough. He and Delilah arranged for Constance to move to a memory care facility in Knoxville, close to Delilah's house. Delilah visited twice a week. Sometimes Constance knew her immediately. Sometimes it took longer. Sometimes the knowing didn't come at all. On the days it didn't come, Delilah would sit with her anyway, would hold her hand, would talk about whatever came. The roses, the weather, what Iris had said that was funny, what Eli had built this week. And Constance would listen with the pleasant openness of someone who is content in the present tense, who does not need the past to make a moment feel safe. The twins met their grandmother in May, 8 months after Delilah's first return to Caldwell Street. They drove down on a Saturday. Iris brought flowers, irises, purple and yellow, which Constance held in her lap and touched with both hands like something precious. Eli sat across from her and showed her photographs on his phone of the bridge model he'd been designing for a class competition. Constance studied each photograph with serious attention. She said, "That's quite good." She said it the way she had said things when Delilah was young, the careful, precise delivery of a compliment from someone who did not give them casually. Eli looked up and said, "Thank you," and his voice had something in it that he would later tell Delilah he couldn't fully explain. Like something he hadn't known was missing, he said. She said, "I know." Iris went back to Caldwell Street. She asked to go alone, which surprised Delilah and then didn't. She went on a Sunday afternoon and walked through the house with Marcus, who had the key, and she came back quieter than she'd left, but with something resolved in her face. She told Delilah that she'd gone out to the backyard and found, in the corner by the fence, growing through the gravel where someone had left a small patch of soil uncovered, the volunteer shoots of a rose bush, not planted, not tended, simply persistent, coming up from old roots that had been there so long they had survived the removal of everything above them. She said, "I think we should plant it properly. I think we should do something with it." So they did. On a Saturday in June, Delilah and Iris and Eli and Marcus went to the house on Caldwell Street, and they dug out that corner of gravel and worked the soil and planted around those old roots and added 3 new plants. Hybrid tea roses, deep red, which Iris had chosen because she said that if you're going to do a thing, you should do it intentionally. They worked for 4 hours. Their hands were dirty and their backs ached, and at some point Marcus told a story about their childhood that was mildly embarrassing to Delilah and made Iris laugh so hard she sat down on the ground. The light was good that afternoon, gold and long and warm the way late June is, the kind of light that makes things look more like themselves. Delilah stood back at one point and looked at the rose bed and at her children working in it with her brother and felt something that was neither peace nor completion. She was honest enough with herself to know that some losses do not complete, that 18 years of absence does not become nothing because a story finds its way to a better chapter, that the woman who had walked away from this house in November had not been healed by returning, but had been made larger, had extended the perimeter of what she was willing to hold. That was not the same as forgiveness. Maybe it was the beginning of it. Or maybe it was its own thing, something without a precise name. The state of being a person who has endured what should not have had to be endured and who has chosen, day by day, in the specific, unglamorous way that choices are actually made, to build something rather than be reduced. Constance died the following October, quietly, in her sleep, in the memory care facility in Knoxville, with a photograph of the rose garden on the table beside her bed. Not the gravel, not the absence, but an old photograph from the 80s, the garden at its peak, roses fat and red against the white fence, the light, the color of late summer. Iris had found it in the box from the study and had it framed and put it there. Constance had looked at it every day for the last 4 months with an expression of uncomplicated pleasure, as though the roses were simply there, simply real, as available to her as the present moment. Delilah received the call at work in the middle of a shift in the neonatal unit. She finished the next 20 minutes because there was a baby who needed her, and she was a person who finished what needed to be finished. And then she went into the family consultation room and sat down and let it move through her. The grief was real, and the grief was complicated, and she did not try to simplify it. She let it be everything it was: loss and anger and relief and love, and the particular sorrow of time that cannot be returned, of years that are simply gone, of a mother who had looked at her daughter on a porch and not known her, and had, in the last year, held her hand and said her name and leaned into her shoulder with the weight of someone who feels safe. These things were both true. They lived in the same place. June Albright was still alive. She was 81 and had retired from the library 6 years earlier and lived in the small bungalow with the cedar and lavender guest room and the yellow curtains. Delilah called her on the evening of her mother's death, and they talked for an hour. June's voice was the same, direct, warm, practical. She said, "I'm so sorry, honey." She said, "How are the twins?" She said, "You did right by your mother." Delilah said, "I tried." June said, "I know you did. Trying is what it is." Iris graduated from medical school at 26. Eli had his first engineering project featured in a regional publication at 24. These things happened in the regular ongoing way that the good things happen, not as reward or culmination, but as consequence. The natural consequence of a woman who had stood on a porch in November with a duffel bag and $43 and had refused day after day in the specific, unglamorous way refusals are made, to be reduced to what was done to her. The house on Caldwell Street is currently being maintained by Marcus, who is considering what to do with it. The rose bed in the corner bloomed last spring. All 4 plants, including the old roots, which produced 3 roses in June, deep red, slightly smaller than the new ones, but vivid and exact in the long afternoon light. Delilah went to see them. She stood at the fence and looked at them for a while. She thought about her mother in her housecoat with her scissors. She thought about the plastic bag in the gravel. She thought about Iris sitting on the ground, laughing. She thought about a folder worn smooth at the fold. She thought about a nurse with a braid and a soft voice saying, "You're doing so beautifully." If you are watching this, and you are in the part of the story that feels like November, if you are standing somewhere cold, with less than you need, and no clear direction, and the door that should have been open is closed, I want you to know what Delilah knew, what she held on to in the coldest parts of the years that followed. She didn't hold on to hope exactly, not the large abstract version. She held on to something smaller and more durable. She held on to the next step, the next shift, the next textbook chapter, the next morning that came whether she had earned it or not. She held on to the faces of 2 people who existed because she had kept going, who were magnificent because she had chosen, every single day, to be the kind of person who keeps going. That is not a small thing. It is not a small thing to survive what you were not supposed to survive and to build something real inside the ruins of what you were told you could not have. It costs everything, and it is worth everything, and the cost and the worth do not cancel each other out. They coexist. That is the whole of it. The roses came back. They always come back.